Welcome back on behalf of SCA to our third webinar in the Supporting Strata series. Now, we never expected to be needing to do these on such a regular basis, but we've been inundated with your questions. We're here to support you during unprecedented levels of uncertainty, and we continue to receive questions where we may or may not have the answers, but we can certainly do our best to bring together content experts. By way of a quick update before I turn to our two experts who are joining us today to assist answer your questions, we have been very busy. It seems like an eternity in Strata, but it's only been 2 days since we spoke last. Since then, we have had ongoing collaboration with international counterparts. We've sought to get lived experiences from the UK and from the US so that we can get ahead of the curve, because they're arguably a week or so ahead of us. And some of their experiences lead to very somber kickers for what we need to do to make sure that we do get ahead of some of the potential downstream issues that come about in a full lockdown. As at this afternoon, we heard our Prime Minister say that we're moving towards a hibernation state. But respectfully, we cannot hibernate in Strata. Strata is where everyone at a ground zero level will be going to isolate. So our need to service our community is greater. We are seeing experienced, certainly massively increased levels of expectation around services on site. Huge amount of questions to our staff, to our support, and to our members across the state and across Australia. And frankly, we're trying to work as much as we can with those uncertainties to bring to you some bits of advice to make your job a bit easier. At a government level, we have had several meetings over the past few days. We continue to lobby for significant legislative either understanding or change to assist us through the challenges ahead. However, we don't have those. So our recommendation to you, and particularly as I pass across to our experts, is Strata needs to lead that change. We need to be the solution that our owners are seeking, and we can do that, and we can do it together. So let's continue to share that information. Let's continue to support our communities. And in that regard, I'm very thankful to be joined by Frank BOROSS, who is the CEO of Haven Cab and National Facilities Management, and David Bannerman, who is the head partner at Bannerman's Lawyers. You can say hello, gentlemen, all out there. Now, Frank, I'm going to start with you, if I may. I talked about strata plans being at ground zero. If they're at ground zero, then you're the general on the ground at the moment, coordinating the troops and keeping everyone sane. So tell me a bit about the experience from a facilities manager's perspective about what you're seeing out there in Strata world.
Yeah, look, certainly, Chris, thanks for that question. Look, certainly, I think the key message that we need to send out is preparedness, preparedness, preparedness. The more you're prepared, the better outcomes you will get. And to give you an example, we had a webinar this morning with 80 of our facility managers and key senior managers going through the processes and protocols that we've put in place over the last, or reviewed over the last 3 to 4 weeks. As we're live going to air, we've got a case where currently there's a person that was in isolation, is now in an ambulance that has walked through common property, touched lifts, and met the ambulance on the lower levels. So we've got a decontamination team in there half an hour ago, decontaminating areas and so forth. And so if our company or other companies and building managers and committees are not prepared for this, then that'll be a significant loss and result in significant carnage down the track. So look, what we're seeing on the ground is there's a lot more people staying at home because of these restrictions around people working from home. So there's a massive load on the apartment infrastructure. So currently are being used more frequently. The common areas are being used more frequently, and of course, with that comes additional waste, additional recycling, and that's just the start of it. Our managers are inundated with hundreds more emails. We 2 weeks ago put out a cross-board policy that all our managers need to be closed locked door. All communication has to occur via mobile phones or through email. and that seems to be working. Owners are cooperating. But again, look, you need to get your strata manager involved. You need to work very, very closely with the committee to make sure that everybody works as a group to make sure you deliver the outcome.
Look, Frank, to that point, I mean, you've just raised several issues that I want to unpack. And one of them also, which is a question that's been put through by one of the participants. So the first one, let's talk about the preparedness of buildings to cope with the capacity and the demand of everyone being in isolation or potentially being locked down at once, because waste systems are not designed for maximum occupation. They're designed for people to go to work every day. So how are we going to accommodate that? And do buildings have the physical infrastructure to even do so?
Yeah, look, great point. So look, we spoke with a number of councils throughout Sydney in this last week, being prepared for this. And again, even they don't have a plan. They don't see the waste, or they haven't thought about this the waste being additional. So that's very, very concerning. What we've put in place is, look, we've got a number of other additional contractors that can come in, pick up additional waste when and recycling when required. But having said that, the cleaning teams are struggling because there is more waste and there is more recycling in the on the floor waste rooms. And I think moving forward, this is something that owners really need to consider, because it'll be an ongoing issue.
Yeah, Frank, I mean, there's so many questions that we have, and we've been inundated, I guess, with a lot of the practical issues. Now, no one knows what a lockdown looks like in Australia, but I can give you an indication, because talking to our counterparts in the UK, their one bit of advice is try to get out of the thinking about some sort of a staged implementation and what your plan would be over time. Expect a full lockdown, expect how to deal with those communities, and put in place plans now. And a lot of those plans revolve around a preparedness of the community within those buildings, having social groups that they can actually rely on. So obviously we'll be charged as professionals that support these buildings and these schemes with dealing with a lot of the mechanics about how it works. And I'm confident that collectively we'll come up with those solutions. It'll be challenging, and there'll be a lot of answers that we don't have, particularly to a lot of vulnerable owners who need some assurance during this time. But I would, taking a leaf out of what happened in the UK, move ahead of the community expectation and establish social groups now so that they know who they can rely on when they do go into lockdown. So Frank, I'm just going to, David, I know there's a lot of legal questions. We've got plenty of time. I'm just going to go to a couple more with you, Frank. From a practical perspective, Frank, and this is equally relevant to strata managers. As I said at the outset, we are busier now than ever. We will be forced to innovate around solutions to solve a lot of these social cohesions and building continuity issues moving forward for the foreseeable future. So I believe our role is more important. Yet there will be pressure on our agreements, because generally our customers and everyone else in the marketplace is experiencing a huge amount of vulnerability around what costs they can and can't pay. If a building manager can't be on site, how do they sustain and support that building, particularly remotely?
Yeah, great question again, Chris. So look, in today's environment, most businesses would have cloud-based servers, cloud-based software systems. So, for example, we implemented remote desktop technology a number of years ago, and therefore, and also mobile hardware management. So, all of our staff are on iPads, iPhones, and can communicate easily through that. All the systems like MyBoss, Building Link that we're using to manage the assets are also cloud-based. So we can manage that remotely, as can any other manager that is using that system. As a precaution, a few weeks ago, we analysed and tested all of our systems around remote capability. So I'm talking, where we've got larger sites, where we can control the building management system remotely. We can log in, and we tested that to make sure we can log in. Where we've got access control, can we log in? Can we let people in and out, through there? Look, some sites yes, some sites no, but we've put a plan in place for that. And these are usually typically the bigger, the bigger sites where we do have facility managers. And I understand that, look, not every building and not every strata building, has that capability, but where they don't, I think, working closely with the strata manager or even at this point, you know, trying to get the electrical contractors to set something up with the committees and owners corporation, so the committees actually can do some of this stuff where there is no building manager available, or get the strata managers to assist. So look, going remote is not a difficult thing if the infrastructure and you have that in place.
And Frank, I know during some of the comments here on the chats, Sydney City Council are increasing their waste services. So they're cognizant of this increased capacity and demand in these buildings. But that's going to mean that the on-site, and I know you've got a cleaning business as well, but the on-site cleaners are going to be doing more. And I imagine a sustained period of heightened sensitivity around health and hygiene. So to the question around what happens in terms of a lockdown around building management, like strata management, I think they become not just essential, but they become critical. And then I think we need to become accustomed to the fact that our services are going to be in more demand than ever. So we need to make sure that we communicate and exhibit value to our customers and show them and support them through this level of uncertainty. I'm going to come back, Frank.
Sorry, Chris, go on.
No, I was going to come back because I've got a whole bunch of questions, but I want to sort of dovetail into something here with David, because David, there are a lot of questions around the legalities of what happens if someone is tested or deemed to be tested or suspected of being positive to COVID-19 and how we can deal with that. One thing we don't have at this stage is any definitive government guide. And I can tell you, we're not alone. Around the world, no one has this guide. And rather than waiting on government to provide it to us, I suggest as an industry that we form our own. So we're working on best practice guides, on protocols, and on things that we can give you to make your lives a bit easier to deal with this. But Dave, let's go practically. Compliance is going to be thrown out the door for a while. How do we deal with that at a practical level? I mean, I know you're going to say that you still need to comply, but is there a soft or a grey level of compliance? And how do we work with government around their statement of legislative intent so that we can get practical solutions for our communities?
Okay, well, there's a lot of interesting information, but the bottom line is that if you have a report in the building of somebody with the virus, whether they've been hospitalised or not, if you're an employer and it's in relation to an employee, you've got an obligation to notify WorkSafe. There's no obligation for the owners corporation, who is not a PCBU, to notify anybody. The record of any correspondence that comes in about the issue just forms normal books and records of the owners corporation. The landlord, if they're renting a building to somebody, you might have noticed that there's some new landlord disclosures. So if you've got a prospective tenant and the building's got several cases of the virus, it might well be considered a health issue, and that should be something that should be disclosed to the landlord. But apart from that, those bases there, the owners corporation is free to do whatever it wants to do in relation to safety, so long as its bylaws permit it to make certain issues. Now, one of the questions that we first were faced with was, oh, we've got a common property gym, and that's not a public place because there's lots of cases to say that common property isn't a public place. And we've got pools, and that's a common property pool, that's not a public place. So therefore, we've got all these people coming into the building and they want to use the pool and the gym to clear their head. Our view is that although the legislation, like usual, doesn't really take into account the fine detail between public places and common property, it's pretty clear that when you read all the other government statements of intention about self-isolation, distancing, health measures, that closing a common property pool and gym would fit within the government statement of intention to help minimise the transfer of the virus. So you've got those initial steps to take. Another interesting question was, well, how do you maintain self-distancing in a lift that doesn't permit the required measurements for self-distancing? Well, that came back to another question that somebody posed to me to say, oh, look, I've got this general meeting coming up and we've already issued the notice. Can we subsequently write and say, oh, we're not going to do it? No, not once you've convened a meeting. Oh, can we subsequently write and say, oh, we're not going to do physical attendance? No, you can't do it because you've already convened it that way. But you can rescue the situation and say, oh, look, we're going to get a whole lot of proxies to a whole lot of our employees, and then only our employees are going to attend the meeting. and there won't be any other people attending because that's a business decision that you decided to make to mitigate the risk within your own business. And then run the meeting on the proxies that you've obtained and exclude people. And if people are excluded and they have the view that if they weren't excluded that the vote would have been different, then they can march off to NCAT and try and overturn the decision. But alternatively, you know, in relation to the measures proactively that owners corporations can take, I mean, there's some pretty simple ones there that I've just rattled off. Close those common property facilities. In relation to the self-distancing, you know, if it's common sense, you know, if it's only room for one person to maintain self-distancing, then one person should get in the lift. If you put 3 people in the space of where one person has adequate space, well, then it's up to that person to say, sorry, mate, next time. Now, that's going to put incredible strain on lift capability systems, but really what's going to happen is you're going to have fewer people doing outside activities. I'm anticipating that similar lockdown laws to other countries where you'll get one shopping visit a day, you'll get one walk a day, you'll get a trip to the pharmacy a day, and that'll be it. So that'll be 3 potential uses of the lift, and possibly some people going to use the bin services and things like that. But otherwise, everybody's going to be travelling through the building a lot less because they're limited to those 3 occasions. So it's not like going to be Christmas holiday time with people really using facilities at a high level and a high rate. So you'll have lower usage, I think, but greater usage than what it would normally be during the day because people are at work.
Yeah, look, can I just expand on that a little bit, David, because you raised some good points. One is we put out a recommendation around common property in any capacity where there's a likelihood of congregation or risk of virus spread. And we've recommended that they be shut down. There's unlikely to be a direct instruction from government that's so specific to relate to elements that we can actually draw on and say that a pool within an owner's corporation is captured there. But common sense says that if we're going to do our part to lead the process of flattening the curve, that we be sensible and take a self-aware perspective of actually doing our individual jobs. And I went out on radio and in broadcasting to Strata owners that they have a personal obligation to do their part, and they can't simply rely on us for all the answers, because I know that they're burdening you as managers out there with all of these answers and asking for you to point to parts of the legislation or parts of the Essential Services Act or something that validates that. And the frank reality is we don't have that level of validation at the moment. What we do have is duty of care to move within what we have and to deal with, I guess, a health issue that's escalating out of control across the country. David, another one around the lockdown from a lived experience in London is that the essential services do apply to multi-unit dwellings, so to strata plans. And they apply because they recognise the security and the safety function, the hygiene function, the sanitation function, but also the social aspects of strata living. So if you're a strata manager or a building manager, in the context of an area like London, you're allowed to go to work. You have to obviously practice social distancing. You need to make sure your workplace is capable of allowing you to do so. But without that level of management, either off-site or on-site, the risk that the society that lives within strata, which is a huge number of people in New South Wales and nationally, falls apart. So our role, as I said, is more critical than ever. We have written to the government to have it enshrined in them that strata and building management is recognised as essential service. So we are going to continue to work there. And the question is...
I think that...
Oh, sorry, is that you, David?
Yeah, well, given the government's recent statement of intent, which was going to continue to uphold the rule of law effectively, like with licensing, Home Building Act requirements, it doesn't look like they're pretending that they're offering any lax, even things like annual fire safety statements. I mean, they want to ensure that if there's more people occupying these buildings, that these buildings are properly serviced, are properly inspected and safe to live in. So I don't suspect that building management and strata management services would be precluded because it would create chaos to achieve their end result. Yeah.
I think far from being precluded, David, they will actually be leaned upon more. And to that point, so Frank, your teams out there, your building managers, what's their experience around trades attending site? So are trades now expressing reservation around attending? Do they want more precautions or more disclosure about potential infections?
Yeah, look, absolutely. So look, what we did was we put out a survey to all of our contractors around this and gave them a checklist that they need to fill out. So basically, have you been overseas? Have you got fever? Have you done this? So a whole heap of different questions in relation to where you've been. That gets filled out and that then gets sent to our manager before they're allowed on site. Further procedural items, they have to have PPE. They have to contact the building manager, via phone and email. So limiting, keeping that 1.5 metre distance. We know as best as we can that they abide by that. So look, there is issues though, with self-isolation and other things that I think we need to also talk about, because that's a really important topic down the track.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I guess, David, so we're talking about the government having an expectation, and from our discussion, they are sensitive and aware of the fact that we're all in uncharted waters here. So they know that there's going to have to be looseness around the way Strata compliance operates, particularly annual fire safety statements or things that are key dependent on inspections. But the challenge we have is it's not just one department that needs to be flexible. It might be council, it might be NCAT or the courts, it might be government themselves. So can we expect there to be, and drawing on your experience and also any potential offshore precedents, can we expect there to be an overarching legislative sort of leave of absence, if I may use the word, where we're unlikely to see the same level of prosecution for a period of time?
One of the questions that is asked, and which I just covered, was the area of annual fire safety statements. Now, if the government's got increased occupancy with people who can't leave the building, who are told to stay there, they're going to want to make sure that those buildings are considered safe. Now, I don't see them letting up on the need to provide an annual fire safety statement, but what I am hearing in the community, because I've been in self-isolation since the 18th of March, because I was in Canada and I came back after the self-isolation, so I haven't actually been outside my living room for too long a time. But you're all going to experience that very shortly, is my guess. By the end of the weekend, you'll be self-isolating yourself. But with the annual fire safety statement system, you've got the PIN, the penalty infringement notices, 1 week, 1,000, 2 weeks, 2,000, 3 weeks to 4 weeks, 4,000, right? Penalties are a deterrent. So they're trying to deter an activity. Now, with your annual fire safety statements, you're supposed to start arranging your inspections by 9 months before the expiry of the 12 months from the time you lodged it. So you'll know whether or not you've got difficulties getting access or the contractors pulling the pin because they're too scared and you've got to try use someone else. To avoid the penalty infringement notice being issued, you need to enter a dialogue with the relevant council to say, and this is before the 12 months hits, to say, guys, these are the endeavours we've tried. These are the units we can't get access to. It's actually a defence. If a lot owner refuses to give you access to an apartment, it's a defence to prosecution. It's specifically set out in the Strata legislation. But let's say you've got a contractor who won't do the inspections because he's too scared or he's not satisfied with your safe work method statements for dealing with cleaning and whatever else, and everything else that goes on. Or, if one of the questions that he asked was there a coronavirus outbreak reported in the building, and if you give a genuine answer, yes, and then he goes, well, forget it, I'm not coming, that would be a pretty logical response. Then it's incumbent upon the Strata manager to have a dialogue with the council to say, look, don't penalise us, we're doing what we can. If you issue a penalty, it's not going to act as a deterrent, it's just unfair and we'll have no choice but to take it to court. So what I'm suggesting is that there'll be a different approach with every bit of compliance. The way that you deal with your work health and safety requirements for lift certification and all those sort of things, you'll have to, get on the front foot with the authority before the due date to suggest we're doing what we can. This is what we've been able to achieve so far. We think it's safe, but we've just been able to do these little bits. We can't give you the complete certificate. Don't prosecute. I think that's the next step that people have to start planning in relation to their management. So how do they deal with the delayed certification? I mean, the Office of Fair Trading come out and said, well, we're not going to extend warranty periods. We're not going to give you more time to sue people. So owners corporations will have to work with the extendable things that they can get extension with, and that's usually penalty infringement notices. At present, like even with the licensing, they didn't let off or give an extension on the 23 March licensing date for the licensing requirements. So they're trying to hold everybody accountable as best they can. And there's been, I don't think it's way too early for them to be coming up with things where they're going to put a handbrake on and give people more time to do. So you need to assume that there'll be no leeway, but you'll have to plead for leeway to avoid penalties being undertaken. But where there's certain steps that need to be done, like, you know, you've got to have a general meeting to get a new contract because your contract's going to expire. And if it expires, what's going to be incumbent on you as the strata manager to make sure you get a general meeting up to give you the relevant appointment so you've got a continued contract. So
David, to that point, we've seen some commentary come through that the City of Sydney and others are already allowing a level of flexibility there in terms of extension. So, you know, it does give comfort that we are going to see potentially some level of flexibility so that we can get hopefully some level of consistency in application. Challenge will be, you know, just how much exposure or damage can be done while we're still waiting for that level of clarity because, you know, there is still a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of government departments working out of step with each other. So I'm just going to go another question for David for you, and it's around strata searches. So strata searches in particular have an obligation obviously to be conducted within a certain amount of time, and they're typically conducted on site at the strata manager's office. Some management companies are prepared in terms of having a number of their documents online. Some don't have any, and some have a full set of historical archive records. How do you expect to see that work in the event of a shutdown where we still need to ensure that the contract for sale process and the real estate market continues, but it's going to be obviously continued under a different set of rules?
Well, I think you're going to see the conveyancing market come to a grinding halt because they've refused inspections for doing home inspections. It looks like the only way that you're going to be able to affect the sale is through private treaty, single home inspections. So you still will have some activity in the conveyancing circles, but you won't have auctions and open for inspections. And so they're trying to work around that. But I suspect that little workaround that people have been trying to put in place is going to shut when it comes to a further announcement to be made before Monday, which is what everybody's expecting to be made. So it's a bit of a watch this space. So, but assuming you do need to comply with an inspection and you fail to comply, well then there is a penalty that's payable, quite a small penalty in fact, and it might be a business decision that you take to just wear that penalty. I think it was like $550 or something. Look, I know that, for instance, with my office, we've got everybody working remotely from today. To give you a bit of an incidence of what's likely to happen. I anticipated, because I've been following it very closely since what happened in Japan, and I was watching exactly what happened over there, and I anticipated a similar thing of what happened in Japan to happen here. So Japan dealt with it before the UK and the US, so they're a better model to sort of, with a better history of dealing with it, because they've been dealing with it for longer. They've had a lot more incidents. But with Japan, you'll find that their contamination and their cleaning and the whole culture is a bit different to the Australian culture. Like over there, they wear masks because they don't want to give somebody germs. So the first time I went to Japan, so you've got all these different cultures, all these different attitudes towards cleanliness and compliance. So unfortunately, Australia's not a very compliant place, and cleanliness, we're not known for cleanliness as well. So, so you're going to have a higher, greater difficulty rate getting compliance and getting the actual curve down if it does get going. So I think you're going to have a longer curve in Australia than what you would in a more compliant place, because but maybe our weather and our physical distance and proximity is going to mean our curve is going to be even lower than it won't get too bad. So we'll wait and see. But I'm not allowing anybody in my office who has been on public transport, because that's that's one of the rules that we put in place. We say if you need to get if you need public transport to get to our office, you're not coming to our office. And that includes staff. So, and we've got, we're running a hearing on Monday and the tribunal's closed. And so we have to have the witnesses in different rooms in our office, and our office becomes the hearing room. So we have to have people to come to our office, but we've got all these policies about, sanitizer, self-distancing, non-shaking hands, and all of those sort of things that you've got to do. So I think it's a very much a moving space at the moment, but everyone's got to deal with it differently. The Supreme Court's freaked out as well. They're only doing Zoom conferencing now because they had an infection at the federal court, the solicitor there. But if you follow the trends around the world, you're looking at probably 3 months of self-isolation. Now, so long as, how that's defined and whose essential services will vary from country to country and from state to state, given that each of the states seem to take a different spin on what the Commonwealth's spin is on it. So I think come Monday, and then they'll push through some really urgent legislation probably Tuesday, you'll get a really better picture about exactly who's going to be able to do inspections, what's essential services, what's not essential services. And they're just going to keep amping it up. And then if Australia continues to be non-compliant, then it'll go to stage 4, and who knows what that'll look like and how long it'll take to get to stage 4.
No, there's some really good advice there, David, and I think your experiences from across the globe, particularly the Japanese one, are going to be very relevant. And I think, regrettably, we're going to be in for a much longer period due to some probably laxer initiatives that we have across the country. And Frank, just touching on a few of those, a lot of the questions we've had, particularly pre-production.
Chris, what I will say is so this will happen in Strata, right? So in our building, we had a infection on level 8 and we're on level 7. And we were notified as a commercial building, and then the government sent in their clean-up teams and checked all the air conditioning systems and all this sort of stuff, and declared within 24 hours after the cleaning and checking the air conditioning systems and stuff like that, the building was fit for reoccupation. And then we got a certificate from the relevant government department through the landlord to say that the building's fit for occupation. Now, that's a commercial building, right? Now, one of the questions which I'm going to leave to Frank to answer is, with air conditioning systems that are compromised with the virus, what happens to a strata building that's got to vacate? And what are the methods going to be around that? What's that going to look like for your, we're talking about your preparedness, and then where are these people going to go to as an alternative place of living if they're not allowed to live in that section of the building or in their building? So yeah. I might throw that one to Frank.
No, well, the concept of being moved out and having some sort of an order. Let me come to that, because I wanted to extend, Dave, onto the question around cleaning and qualifications for Frank. So, okay. A lot of people asking: is there a test? Is there a set of documented guidelines? Is there a formal qualification? Is there a particular product? Do you want to step us through, Frank, what is best practice that you understand and how you deal with either preventative maintenance and or decontamination? And then we'll talk to, some of those more nuanced questions around air conditioning.
Yeah, look, absolutely. So look, thanks, Chris. That's a really, really critical question. So look, in terms of cleaning, there's various types of cleaning, and I want to go through it because they're very critical to what we're dealing with. So a normal clean is just a quick wipe with a neutral detergent. You spray it on, you wipe it off, and that's it. It reduces microbes. That's it. Doesn't kill them, just reduces them, right? Then you've got the next layer of sanitize. So sanitize is where we spray the surface, we leave the chemical on for about 10 seconds, and then we wipe it off. So a much more rigorous process and takes a lot longer. Then finally the disinfection, which is the real crux, the bigger clean, where you've got to spray the surface. You've got to leave with a commercial grade disinfectant or hospital grade disinfectant. You need to leave that on the surface that you've sprayed for 10 minutes. You've got to allow that to dry. and then after that, you need to apply a neutral detergent and then wipe that off while it's still wet. And this is critical, because if you don't wipe it off while it's still wet and leave traces, then that becomes a breeding ground for bacteria. So look, the government website is actually giving some information which, look, is correct in a home environment on surfaces like kitchen benches and toilets and so forth. So they're saying, look, clean with bleach. Look, bleach is great and it will work. The problem is that it damages a lot of the surfaces. So we can't go and spray bleach on an elevator, for example, because it'll stain the elevator. You can't spray bleach on timber. You can't spray bleach on a number of different surfaces, because simply it's just not going to work. I'll give you some further facts. So if someone is contaminated or carries the virus and through droplets leaves it on copper, for example, there's tests out of the UK now that suggest that the virus will be live on that for 4 hours, right? On a piece of cardboard, 24 hours. On plastics, 2 to 3 days. And then again, on stainless steel, your lifts, which is the infrastructure where everybody goes through, 2 to 3 days. So if owners' corporations are not preparing to get an additional sanitisation, not just the cleaning, because cleaning is just wiping over. It doesn't kill the germs. You actually have to go through the disinfection process. Now, look, as a precaution, a few weeks ago, we sent out emails to a number of our Strata committees, Strata managers to look at increasing the sanitisation in their buildings. Look, to be honest, the last week we've had a massive uptake. Up to now, or prior to that, there was only a very small number of people took this seriously and actually did that. So look, it's very, very critical that cleaning cleaning hygiene is maintained. Use contractors that know what they're doing. Look, there's plenty out there, but make sure that they're using the right chemicals. The other thing is too, you've got to use chemicals that are approved by the Australian government, because if something happens down the track, then you've got no recourse, or you'll be in all sorts of trouble. So the chemical needs to be approved.
Are you alluding, Frank, there to alternative products and solutions that have been proffered up as a bit of an opportunistic sales job at the moment?
Mate, look, absolutely, no question. There's sanitisers, that are coming into the country that aren't approved by the proper authorities. There's masks. There's a whole other level of people trying to profiteer and make money on, unfortunately, on this issue.
Sorry, I'll just come back to give a proper answer to the question about the inspection of records electronically. So we've been working on special terms and conditions for inspectors to adhere to if they were to get online access. You've got to maintain things like copyright, personal information, things like that. So there was a question there, can you just give them a Dropbox link or a USB and let them have a look at it? That's problematic without appropriate conditions of use and the return and the non-use of that material following the inspection. So I'd be very concerned about just providing access to records in that fashion.
Yeah, look, David, to that point, SCA is working, as you know, on a set of standard motions that we can provide as options to owners, corporations to consider how to innovate. And I might just talk to a few of them, Dave, because one of the big challenges that we see coming is obviously the financial duress. And that's going to have significant impacts on the availability of owners to pay for their services that they need and also for their cash flow. So one challenge that we put to the government is an opportunity to defer any interest payments, as I've communicated before, to have alternate uses of capital works funds, to allow transfers between funds and to allow owners corps to, for a period of time and a short period of time, be more flexible around their financial arrangements. Saying that, we need to be hugely aware that owners corporations need to be financially viable to see this through, because without the proper amount of capital to get through, we've talked about the heightened sense of need and intensity and use of the common property. So Dave, how and what sort of initiatives can we put in place from a legislative level around bylaws that can facilitate cash flow smoothing or consideration around opportunities owners might put in place?
A bylaw would be of no force or effect. It could only say what the legislation says. So the way to deal with it, to reduce the contributions to the Capital Works Fund, is simply to put up a motion to rescind the former capital raising, to reconsider the adopted 10-year plan, because they're required to raise funds to meet the items set out that they're going to meet in their 10-year plan, to then modify by resolution, not by modified 10-year plan, the contribution periods and the amounts for those periods, and thereby stringing it, pushing it out further in relation to capital works. And once they've adopted the modification to the 10-year Capital Works Fund plan to string it out further to reduce the capital works funds, then they raise a levy based on that. So I'll just repeat, rescind the motion, amend the Capital Works Fund contribution plan to push it out by way of a simple motion to say, well, we're not going to do painting this year, we're going to do that in 2 years' time, example. And then re-raise the levies and to simply match whatever the Capital Works Fund plan is that the Owners Corporation has resolved to do during that period. Now, I've only been talking about capital works. I haven't been talking about the administrative works. Now, if there's a genuine estimate for dealing with administrative expenses, the Owners Corporation needs to raise funds to meet the expenses. Now, that fundraising, that could be offset with finance. It could be offset with other types of deals that the Owners Corporation want to do. They might want to sell off some common property. They might want to just do whatever it is. But it is vital that they have funds, because this could have financial ramifications that last 24 months and several storms and several problems, right? And if you've got all these owners corporations generally don't have adequate funds to match their sinking fund plans, but they're getting better at it than what they have been in the last 5 years. Now, if you all of a sudden wind that back to have all these buildings have zero capital sinking funds and significant works are being done, are required to be done, but they're not being done, you're just going to have incredible disharmony, a lot of complaints down at NCAT and for trading in whatever format they're doing it, whether it's telephone, audio, visual, or whatever. And you're going to create a storm of disharmony. So I think it's important that owners corporations work out their minimum operational requirements for the admin fund and look at considering deferring non-essential capital works upgrades, modifying the 10-year capital works fund plan, re-raising levies.
That's right. So a lot of practical tips there, David, on how owners corporations working with their strata manager and building manager need to solve and adapt for how we're going to deal with it. So, and I know there's another question that's now come through our Q&A channel, and Frank, you and I will discuss this briefly. We just lost David for a sec, but he'll come back. In the event of a lockdown, and we've talked about it, that the potential reduced on-site management hours are going to be complemented or replaced by off-site innovation around how we service these communities. So the fact that someone is not there sitting at a desk between 8 and 4 doesn't mean that the services to provide and support that owners corporation are going to be any less. In fact, I think the investment on behalf of companies such as yourselves and others is actually going to increase, because you'll have to adapt, you'll have to leverage technology, you'll have to make more solution-based sort of products out there to make sure that you can deal with that increased habitation. So I think there's a question here about, will we expect to see lower contract costs? I expect them to be maintained, because the method of servicing them is going to increase in difficulty exponentially. Do you agree, Frank?
Yeah. Look, absolutely, no question. I think, as you had said, if we look at the UK with what happened with their contracting or with their teams, most of the companies lost 40% of their workforce because they got the virus, right? So that's a really scary proposition. Look, having said that, though, I think because in terms of what we're doing and the lockdown that we've provided at the sites that we have, we are actually working remotely in terms of the owners are not having access to our managers through direct contact, as in face to face, but certainly they're doing as much and more through the email and through telephone and through the other medium. So I don't think that a lockdown really affects the actual operation of the facility. And like you said, everybody's at home. We're getting a lot more emails, and the workload is actually a lot more. Look, we're planning around a total lockdown. What that looks like. How do we allow contractors in for a lift breakdown, for example, because we can't have a lift not operating. All of our building managers now have proper PPE, so masks, gloves, and we'll provide them with more further things to, if they do need to go on site for a case or something like that. I just look, if it's in total lockdown, I just don't think the building will cope, especially around the waste management, the recycling, the touching and sanitizing of areas. Like you have to have some form of some people on site there servicing the building.
Yeah, look, Frank, to that point, mate, and even extending that one step further to other services. So we'll be asked to look very critically at all costs to do with the management of schemes. And that's going to be a necessary reality to smooth the cash flow for owners corporations through these challenging times. But let's take an example of a building that has a pool, it has a lift, it requires cleaning, it requires electricity, it requires gas. Now that pool, even though it's not being used, will still have to be maintained, because you can't allow the chemical levels to get out of balance. Otherwise, you have to drain the pool, and you have to end up at a point in time where you actually need to spend more costs in recovery. So there are going to be some sunk costs that need to be upheld, even though the amenity is not there. So there's going to be obviously a difficult conversation at time around the civil liberties of some, and obviously the costs and the practical realities of others in terms of how we move it forward. But let's not pretend that those conversations are going to occur. We need to come up, as I said, with solutions that adapt to our consumer needs and deal with them to what they actually need at this point in time. So looks like we've lost our legal advisor, who was online, but he's gone into a deep level of self-isolation, and he may come back. There's a couple of questions around the insurance implications, and I know in an earlier podcast we did address those, and we talked about, from an insurance perspective, in terms of whether you can deal with repairs and maintenance and what increased liability that places on you if you're not maintaining those. Thank you, David. Welcome back. He's just connecting his audio. I might just throw across to you, David. I know you've just joined us, and I hate to put something onto you now without any prior briefing, but we're talking about the liability that exists on an owner's corporation or a strata manager in terms of repairs and maintenance and duty of care when you can't access the common property. So what liability exists in that point?
Well, it's a strict liability, and it's unchanged by the failure to get access. And the sort of Court of Appeal affirmed that in a recent decision, which gave more importance as to why owners corporations needed to get access to locks to give effect to repairs. So it's strict, and the fact that you can't give access isn't a defence.
No, thank you. And I noticed there you were very helpful. A lot of you are keeping up more than the panellists here, and you've said that it was answered earlier, Dilba, so we appreciate that. It was answered earlier, and there was a step-by-step put through.
Chris, can I just make a comment as well?
Sure.
So look, I think, what can owners corporations do to try and, reduce their costs? Look, David certainly touched on the capital works. So deferring that, certainly, looking at, non-essential maintenance, and, that could be gardening and other things like that. Looking at things like your external windows, for example, reducing them, from a yearly clean to half yearly clean. On these big sites, you're looking at $120,000 savings. So, there's a lot of ways, but I think, before you do any of that, you really have to sit down, or not sit down, but work through with the strata manager and your facility manager to see what areas, can be cut. Look, I know there's some comments on there, for me not to sell the business, but you need to understand that, cleaning in this environment is one of the most critical areas that you can do, because if you look at Hong Kong, and if you look at Singapore, right, as David had, and also Japan to some extent, Mate, they had street cleaners with blowing, disinfecting areas, throughout their streets and throughout all touch points in the areas. And so that was a serious way in which they controlled the spread of the disease as well. So I'm not selling myself here. It's you need to make sure that the right cleaning systems are done. So thank you for that panelist's question.
Yeah, look, and I think, I know you're here as an expert, but it's also your learned experience that you've got on the ground here that's going to provide value to everyone out there. So, they say cleanliness is next to godliness. And I think at the moment, it's certainly what we need. We need a bit of help from above to make sure we can get through this. There was a very specific question around airflow and obviously air conditioning reticulation. And you mentioned at the outset, Frank, around the spread of the disease, particularly in an airborne fashion. Are you seeing an increase in the desire to have air conditioning systems cleaned or filters cleaned? And do you expect that to be an ongoing request from consumers and from buildings to have that done on a regular basis?
Yeah, look, air conditioning systems. Sorry, you there, Dave? Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. Look, air conditioning systems are already maintained, within apartment buildings. Look, we have had that over the last few months. Contractors coming in and offering a hospital grade system whereby the particles can be caught up. But this is only very recent, and we're assuming that this is moving forward, that's something that owners should consider putting in.
David, question for you. Do you expect through all of this that one solution may well be compulsory appointed managers who are put in place to deal with obviously the hierarchy of building needs and go to some sort of priority list of maintenance, assuming we're in a situation where, if we take the lead from the US during the GFC, had 40% levy arrears, and we can assume this is going to be a little bit worse in terms of the impact in the US potentially. Is the compulsory manager a solution here?
Look, we just had a hearing today to appoint a compulsory manager, and the main thrust of it was that with this coronavirus, with a dysfunctional scheme where they're unable to make sensible decisions, this is more an important time to have a compulsory manager than any other time. So you can get rational decisions being made about expenditure cleaning to deal with incidents on an urgent basis. So I see that the tribunal is going to be granting interim order section 237 appointments on a greater frequency than what they were formerly because of the difficulties that are being faced.
And David, to that point, with the tribunal being in lockdown and only accepting written submissions, obviously the likelihood of these being put in more frequency without a degree of defence is going to be increased?
What they're doing is they're putting in written evidence with the written application in the usual format to the registry, and then the hearings are being conducted by telephone. So the parties dial in, and evidence is, it's difficult to give the evidence because you say, have you got this document? Read it. So it's difficult to give language if someone's burning turkey to these things done. I think that the tribunal realises that there is a bigger problem coming next week, and that is self-isolation, being able to manage that. And I would think that that's why I'm thinking they're going to be granting more interim orders than what they've done in the past for 237 appointments. Yeah.
Well, I think we had a little bit of you freezing there, David, so you were stuck in self-isolation, but I think everyone got the point there. I go back to Frank, and I'm mindful of the time, and we've got about 5 more minutes, so keep your questions coming through the Q&A. There has been a question around what obligation do we have? And I know you answered this at the start, but can you insist, David, on identifying someone who has potentially been notified that they're COVID-19 infected? And if you can't get that level of assurance, can you go to the authorities, i.e. the police or someone else, to enforce the health guidelines? Because now there is a fine for people who don't properly self-isolate.
Oh, there's, as an individual, you don't have rights of enforcement to say that you should be self-isolating and what are you doing? A bit like a complaint to that person in Melbourne who was in Aspen and and then was going around all golf courses and everything else. So individuals don't have a right of enforcement, but they can certainly report it to all of the people, the authorities, and then they can issue penalties, like the police and all these other different authorities now checking to see if people are in self-isolation when they've been come back from overseas and things like that, and issuing the $1,000 fines. So it's from a strata manager's point of view, you have no enforcement powers, but to inform the authorities. And all the records just form normal records of the owners corporation.
Now, David, I'm going to get you just maybe to park it because you've been cutting in and out quite significantly, but that's okay. We're nearly done here. There is a question around Airbnb, and I know this has been discussed on a number of different forums. So it's obviously a challenge that we have a potentially increase in social issue out there where we're going to need as many beds as possible to potentially cope with isolation. So I think it's probably more a village-based response around how we work within the parameters of bylaws, within the parameters of making sure that we understand who is coming into our properties. But I don't think now is the time to overly politicise Airbnb or other share platforms around how we can deal with this issue. I think those issues need to be ventilated at a point, and they're very valid. But if we're talking about at the moment an obligation in society to make sure that we can isolate people, we're going to need all of those available residential premises or hotel premises. So what we need is a solution to triage people going in and out. And I have noticed for the first time in Sydney that now going into a chemist, they will actually put a temperature gauge to your head and ensure that you're actually going through. Some would say too little, too late, but we're currently at a point in time where we need to step up, obviously, preventative issues to stop the curve. So mindful of the fact that we are now right on completion time, I'm going to throw one more question to our panellists. And for everyone else out there, we're hosting these on a regular basis. We're maybe going to do them 3 times a week, depending on your questions. And we'll continue bringing together what information you need, what experts you need, and to answer your question as best we can so that we can make sure that you have educative information to go back to your client base. But my closing questions, I'm going to start with you, David, and follow with you, Frank. What tip do you give everyone out there, knowing that we're likely on the doorstep of a hard lockdown, to prepare themselves as a business and obviously to help their customers moving forward? Dave?
Okay. Prepare for a 3-quarter recession for your own business. So 3/4 of downward growth and more, because that's just what they're forecasting now. So you need to make yourself as bulletproof as you can with expenses, but at the same time be able to provide the services that you need to be able to provide. And there's been a range of questions just in the chat, and I'll just try and wrap those up. As a strata manager, the only obligation to report somebody with COVID is if it's an employee in your employment to WorkSafe. If you're a landlord and the building's riddled with the virus, then you should disclose that to a prospective tenant. Okay, there's no obligation on the strata manager to report a case to the authorities if they're informed of that. So the failure to report it to the authorities isn't going to expose the manager to any risk. For the owners corporation, what is the most proactive thing that they can do? Well, they need to follow the things that Frank's been saying to get the buildings as clean as possible, because that's the key issue. But then they also need to have an evacuation plan in place in the event that the building has several cases and a massive outburst, and they're told that the air conditioning's compromised, the lift's compromised, and they have to live somewhere else for a short period of time whilst the building's put into place. That'd be my suggestions.
No, thanks. Good advice. Frank, yours?
Look, David, I think David's covered, what I was going to say around preparedness. I think, the owners corporation and the strata manager really need to sit down, and building manager if there is a facility manager, but work through, if there is people that are self-isolating, if there is a confirmed case, what processes do you take? Where do you put your waste? How do you take the waste into certain into the waste areas? I think it's crucial that you have that open dialogue between all the parties and ensure that every building is completely different. So no one fit. There'll be no one fit, but have that communication with everybody. And look, on a business, point of view, look, if you can provide the PPE for your staff, get them to go and buy wherever they can, and make sure that they're safe. So yeah.
No, excellent advice. I'd like to thank David and Frank for their professional, obviously, and expert input. We will be back with more questions later next week and throughout next week. I do expect, as David flagged, that there's going to be potentially some escalations that we see over the weekend. We will come to you with advice. As I said, we are meeting with our counterparts, not just in Australia, but internationally, to bring some learned experience. And as I said, please bear with us. These are not perfect solutions. We're working in imperfect times with limited information and fast-moving circumstances. So your patience, both with us and with your customer base, will help us all. But we do acknowledge the work, and particularly I know there's building managers out there who are at ground zero, and we talked about that. Keep up the job you're doing on behalf of those communities. There will be a point in time where they look to the fact that you drag them through this. So please value the work you do. It's certainly valued by the residential communities out there. And to the strata managers and suppliers out there, keep it up. There are people that rely on us. Thank you. Stay safe and be well.